I think they need someone who's, let's face it, less anti-government. I think Laura was tainted by her extreme right-wing attitudes, which I failed to detect. But I think it's time for me now, with my impartial view. To be quite honest, I think, the media, we do love ourselves a great deal. So the idea of, well, who's going to be the political editor, it may not matter that much. Private Eye is a very strange mixture. I mean, if you're starting a magazine now, to say we're going to have it half jokes and half journalism, people are thinking you're mad. How does that work? But it does. I suppose I've been most scared, really, when I thought I've bankrupted the magazine or I've ruined everything. I do, as people often remark, I do hate being wrong, and I do hate losing, which, given how often I've lost in court, is probably not a very good position. But that I do find that frightening.
You have been described at various points as the most sued man in the country. Ian Hislop, hello.
Hello.
How's it going?
Yeah, it's good. Good.
I'm glad. Happy birthday as well to Private Eye magazine.
Thank you.
60th birthday this month. You've been editor of the magazine for 35 of those years.
Yes.
So we'll start there.
Thank you.
And your editorship.
Yes.
Have you ever been scared as the editor of Private Eye?
Do you mean for my own welfare or for the welfare of the magazine?
Let's do both.
Yes, I mean, I've been personally scared. You get a lot of threats in this business, and after Charlie Hebdo, the Home Office sent some people around to ensure that our security was better. So those aren't great times. I mean, the thing with Private Eye is we once had a package came in containing a death threat on a tape, and my secretary, who's called Hillary, is marvellous woman, she said, oh, I don't think it's serious, Ian, it's from Coventry.
Right.
We had a briefing in here from a very serious senior police person, and the staff were assembled, and they said, if anyone should ask, break in and say, who's the editor, what do you say? And my friend Nick Newman said, oh, you say it's him, Ian, him, here.
Point him out to make it easier for them.
So yes, I mean, sort of personally, there have been times. I suppose I've been most scared, really, when I thought I've bankrupted the magazine or I've ruined everything. I do, as people often remark, I do hate being wrong, and I do hate losing, which, given how often I've lost in court, is probably not a very good position. But that I do find that frightening.
You have been described at various points as the most sued man in the country, which is where that perhaps comes from. But let's talk highlights then.
Yes.
What about something you're most proud of?
I'm most proud recently, I think, of just keeping going during the pandemic. I'm literally a year and a half ago, we shut the office down, and essentially everywhere we sell the magazine was no longer open. So someone saying, oh, you can't sell in newsagents, they're not open, airports, no, railways, tube, no, gone. So essentially we had to hope that our readers would find us in terms of taking out subscriptions, and then we started selling in the supermarkets. So A, just being there, B, the coverage of the pandemic, particularly Dr. Phil Hammond's column, which I think has been the saving of many of our mental health, is reading what Phil has to say. And like a lot of our contributors, Phil is like a mouthpiece for every other doctor and medical professional he knows, all feeding in to this incredibly sane and useful column. So I'm very proud of that. Private Eye is a very strange mixture. I mean, if you're starting a magazine now, to say we're going to have it half jokes and half journalism, people are thinking you're mad. How does that work? But it does. And I am equally proud of, say, the recent journalism, the post office workers' stories, probably the biggest miscarriage of justice, by a state institution, totally covered up by government, people put in prison, ordinary people who run post offices told, you're a thief because the computer system says you are, you're going to go to jail. And the computer system, which they knew, was malfunctioning, and they weren't thieves. It was absolutely disgraceful. And it was one of those stories we ran for, God, I mean, nearly 10 years, with the help of, some of the people involved who said, we didn't steal the money, but no one believed them. And that I think is what Private Eye can do. It can take a story and I can put it in every fortnight for a decade.
And eventually they'll listen.
And if people say it's really boring, I say, there you go. And I suppose the trick is you always wrap somewhere else in the magazine, there's something else you like. There's some jokes, there's the cover, there's something that sweetens the pill. I mean, I often say, Mary Poppins is really the philosopher we should all take to heart. It's a spoonful of sugar, and then the journalism goes down.
Helps it on its way. I mean, it wasn't just the distribution of the magazine that was affected either, because it was the production, right? I mean, this room that we're currently sat in now, as I understand it, big old table, scraps of paper, that's how you arrange the layout, and all of a sudden you're not allowed to come here.
No, and it was all entirely put together in, people's kitchens in on the south coast in Hastings and surrounding places where our design team were. So there was St Leonard's is a big design hub now. So essentially we had to reinvent that too. But the essential process was we will get this out.
And generally speaking as well, the Eye has sort of steadfastly refused really to put much of its journalism online. There are some select highlights on there now. Yeah. I assume the pandemic was probably one of the strongest tests of that decision, and largely you stuck to that approach, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, I literally do not want to give people journalism for free. I think it's quite a difficult craft. I was going to say noble profession, but I just slipped back. But it's difficult to do well. It takes time, it takes money, and you have to pay for it. And I'm not giving away the Eye free to people because I have to pay journalists. And to get anything this good, you need to pay people. I also believe, you should be paid properly for the work you do. So the traditional model, as it's now become in journalism, of saying to people between 20 and 40, would you like to work for free? It'll be really good for your career. It'll really build your profile, and I'll give you no money ever. I don't think that's fair, so I don't do it.
Neither do I. How long do you think it's sustainable? Do you think it's sustainable to turn away from the internet? Do you think that's a long-term strategy that could last forever?
Well, I mean, at the start of the internet, I made another decision, which is I put on essentially double the amount of cartoons. And having been told by people, cartooning, it's a dying business, there are no young cartoonists. It's amazing, if you offer people money, they suddenly become cartoonists, and people who can draw and are funny start putting the two together and sending it to you. So that was another, I think, the reason we survived is, I've now got 50 really funny cartoons out of a selection of much, much more, for which I pay proper money. I mean, there's a wonderful guy called Moose who used to be a lot online, fantastic jokes, and I said to him, if you send them to me, I'll give you money. And then a lot of people will think, Moose, you're really funny. And it's an odd model, but let's try it. And so I do think it's sustainable. I think the pleasure of a physical object. Everybody spends too much time on screens. A lot of people are trying to get off screens. They're trying to, for reasons of disconnecting from the people who are commoditizing and buying them and ruining their lives generally, and also it's a basic human pleasure. I think if you've been working at a screen all day, to pick up a physical object, particularly with drawn material in it, and to say, well, I can read that. So, and in Private Eye, sorry, I'm wanging on, but the serendipity of having a piece here, which is saying this old building's falling down, it's really beautiful, could we not have it falling down, next to a piece which is from Beijing saying Xi Jinping, he's not coming to to the environmental talks, partly because he doesn't leave China much now due to reasons of not being that confident, is quite interesting. And it's just all those things together. You get a broad range of things you wouldn't necessarily have decided to read.
Just to make it topical for a moment, you mentioned the social media companies there, and we've seen in response to the very sad death of the MP, David Amess, who was killed, and in response to that, I'm not sure the logic here necessarily follows, but there's been some discussion, indeed some campaigning by MPs, for us to remove anonymity from the social media platforms, that there's this cesspit of abuse on social media, and that perhaps if we were to remove anonymity, things might calm down. What's your assessment of that view?
Firstly, I couldn't understand the debate following Amos's death. It seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with it. And the people who immediately stepped up all seemed to announce their own agenda. As far as I can see, an Islamist terrorist who seems to have had no social media presence at all is suddenly discussed as an example of toxic debate. Now, I'm not sure he was interested in debate of any sort, let alone toxic debate. And he murdered the MP for religious and political reasons of his own. So I didn't get it. I mean, there obviously is a place to talk about social media and how people use it, but that seemed to me entirely not the place. And MPs, I mean, if MPs want to talk about themselves, fine. Absolutely, I'm all for that. But, you know, in the trolling of the Labour MPs during the anti-Semitism row, that would be worth having a look at. The trolling of anybody who voted the wrong way on, say, the school lunches, let's have a look at that. The decision not to pursue various people who went after the footballers or Marcus Rashford, I'm quite interested in that. You know, there are a lot of debates to have, but I think Amos was a misfire. You know, the shock of one of our elected representatives being murdered is big, but I don't think everything isn't about social media, and that seemed to be slightly about, can we have a look at the prevent strategy? Is that working? And why isn't this person known to MI6? What are they doing?
Yeah, those questions seem to follow perhaps more naturally than the one about social media. I agree with you, there's a place for the conversation, whether it's the right one or not. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the other issue, and actually in this fortnight's issue of the Eye, you've covered it, is it doesn't actually also follow whether removing anonymity would soften the discourse, because as you've documented, people are quite willing to put some things in print that perhaps they would never say to someone.
No, it does seem to stop a lot of people. And there was, I mean, the piece also highlights a number of mainstream figures who said, this toxic debate is absolutely awful. These are people who run particularly unpleasant columns, which have their name at the top. They're not anonymous either. So I'm not sure the amount of humbug that followed was actually worth it. You know, much better to start thinking, how important is it that we meet our representatives face to face? Pretty, I think. And what can we do about that, you know, to make them safer?
Yeah, I agree. Let's turn back to your editorship of the magazine. What do you think your time in charge has been characterised by? How do you think people will look back at it and remember it?
I hope they'll look back and think what he did do is from the 70s onwards, is massively increase the journalism. I rehired Paul Foote, which was, you know, perhaps the best thing I ever did, who was the sort of the ultimate eye journalist. And then I hired Francis Wheen. It's the first two things I did as editor. I mean, it's quite important to surround yourself by people who are very good. I just offer this as a tip, because in political life, people now seem to do the opposite. Our current Prime Minister is particularly keen on the strategy of, let's have everyone around me who's useless, so I'll look better. In the end, you just look useless. So I've taken the line that I've hired a lot of very, very good people, and then I take the credit for everything they do.
Very good. Maybe I'll adopt that in our strategy at Politics. Joe, no, you've said in the past that you had to hire 3 people to replace Paul Foote. You know, I wanted to ask you about him, so I'm glad you mentioned him, because he produced some of the greatest campaigning journalism, I think, this country has ever seen. You know, the Birmingham Six come to mind, would probably be a standout. I mean, what was he like to work with?
Paul, fantastic, incredibly modest, incredibly good fun. I mean, funny. And, you know, he was extreme left-winger, which would have annoyed a great deal of some of the readers. But the great thing with Paul is, I mean, we have an extreme, in the joke section, in a very extreme left-winger called Dave Spart. And I used to say to Paul when I read his copy, I'm just going to run the Spartometer over your copy. I just want to check how extreme it is. And then I'd take out the bits that I thought were too much. But basically, he was a fantastic reporter, and what he reported were the facts. And whether it was miscarriages or whether it was... he was the first one who started in on the overseas tax havens, which he then recruited this wonderful journalist called Richard Brooks, who we have, who does all the money now. And Richard used to be a tax inspector. He worked at HMRC and was quite senior. And Paul Foote lured him over to our side, which again is something else I owe Paul, because Richard, he did the post office, but he did the tax, he did corporate tax, he did the sweetheart deals. He's done all that money stuff, which is really good. And Paul essentially initiated a lot of that. I mean, forgive me if I've said this before, but Paul used to give talks to students, and it was incredibly funny because they would say earnestly to him, "What's the secret of investigative journalism?" And Paul said, "The secret is people ring me up and I write it down." So that is basically it. It's he was willing to talk to anyone, interested, and dogged. I mean, it's from him that, you know, essentially the eye gets the idea that you can run the same story forever. I mean, in the annual, I couldn't believe this. It's my favourite page in the entire. We produced this 60-year annual, and every year it shows you a bit of journalism and a bit of the jokes. From 1985, you'll see there's a page we had to redact. That's a story from Liverpool that we ran in 1985, which is still going on in court. So I wasn't even able to run it. And that seems to me about as long as you can go with, you know, the sort of the doggedness of an early story.
The reason I asked about Paul is because you have touched on this already, and I was hoping to contest it and tease it out a little bit more.
Sorry, go on.
No, is how compatible hard journalism is with satire, because there are plenty of people who say the two don't mix, that there needs to be a distinction, that whether it's just for the sake of editorial purposes or commercial ones, that the two don't mesh. And obviously, Private Eye is sort of testament to the fact that they can.
Yes, and I don't agree with that. And I think Paul, I mean, in his character, he loved the jokes. I mean, you know, and basically, we used to tease him about it, but we said he took as long coming up with a bad pun on the top of his piece as he did writing the piece. So he was aware of this, and he found things funny. And there is an earnestness about investigative journalism that can, I think, be counterproductive. So, you know, when The Guardian says we've got the Pandora files, there's 12 billion bytes of information. We've read through 86 zillion files. And I think, oh, fuck. Have you? Was there anything good? And then we've got 38,000 pages where and you say, oh, no. Tell me the story.
Top line.
What's a good bit? Are there some humans in it? Also, I don't want to know how much work you've done. As a reader, I really don't care. I mean, it's great. You've done a lot of work. Good.
I sort of expect it.
Yeah, but also with investigative journalism, you can do a lot of work and there's no story. It is sort of quite wasteful. You can charge around after things and nothing happens. So I do think you need to leaven it. And, you know, the early model, which was my predecessor, Richard Ingram, was sort of very keen on, was he said, you know, you make jokes about things people know, and then you tell them things they don't know. And then the next issue they do know, so you can do the jokes about that, and then come up with some new things. And that way you keep it rolling. So I do think the two are compatible.
this is you talking about someone self-importantly charging around. I'm going to use that to segue to the next thing I want to talk to you about, which is the reports that the BBC is going to replace its political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. Are you interested in taking the job?
Yeah, I've applied.
Have you?
Yeah, I think they need someone who's, let's face it, less anti-government. I think Laura was tainted by her extreme right-wing attitudes, which I failed to detect. But I think it's time for me now, with my impartial view.
Who do you think would be a good fit if you were, if for some miracle, yeah, obviously because you are the front rider in the runners and riders to take the job. Who do you think would fit in, and do you think it's as important a job as some people make it out to be?
Well, I think the obvious candidate is Marc Francois. I think that would keep the backbench happy, and I think both for sort of perception and insight and intellect, and that would be a very, very good choice. Obviously, if we can't have him, Jeremy Corbyn would be good. I think he's short of things to do at the moment, so I think that would be quite an exciting fit. To be honest, again, because of her role during the frantic Brexit pandemonium, where nobody seemed to know from one second to the next what was going on, she became the focus of what's happening now in that incredibly immediate news cycle of, oh God, they've resigned, have they, and who's all that. Then the pandemic, in which the government has, eventually got to tell us what it's doing, whether it's made decisions and what. So we need the BBC there, to say, what are the guidelines? What are we going to do? Obviously, it's a problem. Is the government a lot of the time didn't know what it was going to do. So the messaging was, I love the idea that the messages were mixed, i.e. completely incoherent. So her role became very important. To be quite honest, I think, the media, we do love ourselves a great deal. So the idea of, well, who's going to be the political editor, it may not matter that much. There are other jobs. There are other jobs in the BBC, who's the editor of the Today programme, who's running Panorama. There are plenty of other jobs that are pretty important. And her job involves a lot of running around saying, what's happening this minute? In many ways, that isn't that vital, because the next minute something else is happening. And what we've all learnt, I think, from the pandemic is a slightly longer view on the country's problems is more useful. So rather than saying, well, who's up, who's down in cabinet? Who's Deputy Minister for Paperclips, and are they pro the other person who's just got their job? Or some of that is a bit so what, and a slightly longer look at, in the middle of an energy crisis, why did we sell off that reserve gas tank when the Europeans kept vast capabilities for 80 days of gas? Who was responsible for that? Was that a good idea? Or the sewage crisis, which I absolutely love, because Private Eye about a month ago said, there is this bill going through and you should have a look at it, because it basically means you can chuck sewage everywhere. And a lot of people have said our job as journalists is essentially throwing sewage in the national infrastructure, which I don't mind. It's quite flattering. But it would help if politically people had been having a look at that, rather than saying, well, this new minister for vaccination, who is she? We haven't seen much of her. Well, does that matter hugely? How's the rollout going? Give us the figures. There are other subjects that I think a slightly wider brief. And, political journalism, I don't like talking about the Westminster bubble because, that's what people who don't like democracy do. It's important, but there are other areas outside it.
There's this trend, isn't there, within political journalism, what's happening now, what's going to happen, an obsession with that, and then perhaps not so much of an interest in what happened and why. And actually, a fortnightly magazine can provide you not only with the space to reflect and to analyse, but as you've just mentioned, to actually be ahead of everyone, on social media at the moment, everyone is talking about this sewage problem, but in actual fact, last month,
Yeah, it would have been good if they'd been talking about it before the vote. And those MPs saying, did I vote that way? I had no idea. Well, perhaps you should read the bloody order paper then. That would be good.
don't get too ahead of yourself, Ian.
No. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the budget is absolutely classic. All the journalism have been, we've got a bit of the budget beforehand. Sunak's leaked a bit of the budget. Who leaked the budget? He should go to jail for leaking the budget. Can we look at what's in the budget? Maybe that'd be good. Our story about the budget this week is just having promised that they would tax the tech companies. They haven't. Mm-hmm. They're going to pay less after this budget. Now, I think that's interesting. They've got more money than everyone else on the planet, and they're giving us less. I think that's more important than which bit of it was leaked when.
Our view of the budget is so important that I think literally right now, as we're speaking, Rishi Sunak is about to stand on his feet, and we instead have chosen to speak to each other, Ian. So that's I think, the right way to go about things. I just like to. I need to discuss the sort of the wallpaper role of private eye front pages behind you.
Yes.
before we finish things off. I understand these are your favourites, or some of your favourites at least. Obviously, there are many.
Yes, no, these are a lot of my favourites from the past, and some of the best-selling covers. I mean, the royal family. I mean, we have covered a lot over the years, but Woman Has Baby at the birth of Prince George was one of my favourite covers ever in terms of sheer disinterest. I love George Bush because people have forgotten that we have had a very stupid American president before. Trump wasn't new, and
Repeats itself, doesn't it?
it does a bit. And Bush's countdown to war, in which Bush says 10, 9, 8, 9, 5, 5, 4, was very much my favourite cover. Probably one of our readers' least favourite covers was the 9/11 cover, which I loved, when Bush was sitting in a primary school when the attack happened. And one of his aides came up to him. We just put a bubble on it with the aide saying, "It's Armageddon, sir." And Bush said, "Well, I'm getting out of here."
Yeah, he took a runner, didn't he? He went when they were flying around in the plane after that happened.
He did disappear to a bunker. So I love those.
And just before we started rolling, you were talking about the Rebecca Brooks Halloween special there.
Yeah.
God, your segues, these are fabulous. It's Good Morning Britain for you. Come on. It was the trial of Rebecca Brooks on the phone hacking, for which I should say very clearly now she was found innocent. But it was Halloween, and she chose to wear this sort of New England Puritan outfit for her trial, which we found very, very funny. And the shops were, at that time, withdrawing various Halloween costumes as being too scary. So we thought it'd be very amusing to put Rebecca on the cover and say that this particular Halloween witch costume had been withdrawn from the shops. Now, unfortunately, this came out on the first day of her trial, and the barristers for the Murdoch Empire, who were representing Ms. Brooks, thought this was a fairly straightforward contempt of court. And they said to the judge, "This is a contempt of court. The editor of Private Eye, who at the time was me, should really be punished, possibly with a committal to one of Her Majesty's prisons." And fortunately, the judge, being an incredibly wise and enlightened example of just how good the judiciary is in this country, decided it was not a contempt of court. And various policemen had gone around removing this from the newsstands, and then we managed to get it put back again. So it was on sale again. So I'm particularly fond of that one because it just shows the law in action.
Possibly a Private Eye subscriber, that member of the judiciary. Who knows? Ian Hislop, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me. I really appreciate it. It's been very insightful.
Thank you.